All right, ladies and gentlemen. So today we're going to start our discussion getting into how the US Constitution came to be. Now, where we have to start is our first attempt, which was a failure at having a national government, and that is the Articles of Confederation. So, what the Articles is that government that was in place during the revolution itself, because we needed something to function that would be capable of doing negotiations with like France to get that alliance that we had with them and negotiating peace with Britain, all of that. And also, it is modeled after the colonial governments. So there's a strong emphasis on state independence, state sovereignty, no one having more power than the state governments. And also, this is going to play into the fears that the founders had, like the founding fathers, like Jefferson and all of them, about having concentrated power like into one entity because they just fought a war against a tyrannical overseer that had all the power over them, so they didn't want to experience something like that again, so they are intentionally going to make a weaker national government and have higher state powers over issues. So it is a limited government under the Articles of Confederation. So we're going to have a established firm league of friendship between the states. Like they're not united, but they are allies with each other. So bills were had when they were passed. It had to be 9 out of 13 votes to pass anything on the national level. Amending the articles took unanimous consent of the states. So it's pretty safe to assume that there were like no amendments to the Articles of Confederation, because when you get 13 like state representatives together, the representatives from 13 states, not all of them are going to agree on anything. So it's basically an impossible system to make changes to. All right, let's take a look at the structure of this government. So unicameral means single house legislative body. So that would be like if we only had the Senate as the government and that was it. All right. Each state has one vote regardless of how big their population is. And Congress is given sole authority to govern the country. So there's no president and no judicial system, so no Supreme Court. And we have an executive committee overseeing the government when Congress was not in session. So certain times of the year, the people in Congress, they get to go home. But in this case, there would be a committee that would just take care of maintaining the flow of things while the majority of the government is away. And Congress could establish temporary courts to hear disputes between states. All right, so that's the basics. But now let's take a look at the actual powers of what the Articles of Confederation could actually do for the government. Right, they could declare war and make peace. They could make treaties with foreign countries. They could establish an army and a navy. They could appoint high-ranking military officials. They could requisition, print, and borrow money. They could establish weights and measures, so how everything is accounted for. They could hear disputes between the states related to trade and to the state's boundaries. But now let's see what's denied to the government under the Articles of Confederation. They could not raise funds for an army or a navy. So they can establish one, but they can't raise money to actually create them. So pointless. They had no power to tax or impose any tariffs, so trade taxes, or collect any monies. So they have no way to make money. No executive branch, so there's no way to enforce any laws that the legislation of the Articles of Confederation government even says are laws. There's no way to enforce those laws. There's no power to control the trade between states, so how can they actually make any decisions if they can't control it? no power to force states to honor obligations. So basically, they have no power. So they have no power to regulate the value of currency. So yeah, what might be $5 in Massachusetts might be worth only $3 in Virginia. So yeah, basically the Articles of Confederation had no power to do anything. And that was just the way that a lot of the people wanted it, at least initially. Now, let's look at some accomplishments of the Articles of Confederation. They had the ability to negotiate the Treaty of Paris, ending the American Revolutionary War in 1783. They're going to establish the Land Ordinance of 1785, which is going to sell land and raise money for the government. So it's going to settle a lot of boundary disputes in the territories that they get west of the Appalachian Mountains. They're going to establish a lot of basically public education for children. The Northwest Ordinance of 1787 is interesting because it's going to establish the rules for territories to become states. And it's going to prohibit or say no to slavery in the territories. Well, in the Northwest Territory anyway, which is like the modern day states of Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin, and part of Minnesota. All right. Now, some problems under the Articles of Confederation. Financially, we have tons of debt. We have foreign debt. We owe France and Spain tons of money, millions of dollars. There are state debts. Individual states owed the people, the citizens, millions of dollars. And the federal government, the Articles government, owed soldiers, millions of dollars for fighting the war. So there was a total debt of roughly $80 million, and the government had no way to tax people to raise money to pay off these debts. The states all had their own currencies. And there was interstate trade, but there was no way to regulate anything or charge money on anything. Foreign policy, we're getting threatened by Britain and Spain because there's all this different money being owed and trade issues going on. And individual states, they were able to form their own treaties and make their own alliances with other countries, and it not be effective for any of the other states. Right? Then we have some domestic issues, such as protection, who is going to protect the states? Does the federal government even have the ability to do anything, or does it rely on these state militias? And a big example of that is something called Shae's Rebellion, which is in 1787. But before we get into Shae's Rebellion, let's take a look at the trade problems a little bit. The U.S., we're no longer trading partners with Great Britain. We did just, fight a victorious rebellion against them, so they're not too inclined to do business with us right now. So U.S. exports to British ports had to be on British ships. We're not really doing business with them. So yeah, a lot of U.S. goods were not even allowed in British ports. And the British sent a lot of cheap goods to the U.S. So they're trying to get money out of us, but it's not doing too well. All right. A potential remedy for this, establishing a tariff on British goods, which would, charge them money to sell their stuff to us. Right. Weaknesses of the articles would also prevent this solution from even happening. Now let's talk about Shae's Rebellion real quick. It was led by a guy named Daniel Shae, and this is up in Massachusetts, and where a bunch of farmers basically go into rebellion against the government because of high state taxes, and people were being imprisoned because they couldn't pay their debts, and there was a lack of money about, and there was no formal federal military or state military to do anything. So this movement's just going to grow stronger and stronger, and it's going to strengthen people's need for wanting a national constitution, so like a more solid government. And state militia of Massachusetts luckily was able to disband and break up this rebellion before it got too out of hand. So these are all big signs that something needs to happen to change the situation in America. Right, some social changes that are going to happen under the Articles. Some good, some, for the most part, these ones are good. Abolition of aristocratic titles. So there are no more titles related to nobility. Confiscation of loyalist estates. So people who were loyal to England during the Revolution, they lost their land and it was basically up for sale to anybody who wanted it, who was loyal to the Revolution or not involved with either side. And we would see the separation of church and state, which was like based on the example that Thomas Jefferson gives in his Virginia Statutes of Religious Freedom in 1786. That's a document that's important to the Bill of Rights later on and the Constitution. All right, women and slaves. So with the Articles, women, there was a significant role because their role as teachers. So they're teaching a lot of these new Republican virtues to children. They also provided war food and clothing, and so like they're owed some of that money for those supplies. But they would still be second-class citizens, no voting rights or anything. That doesn't happen until 1920. Slaves, while it does contradict or go against the idea of the revolution, the idea all men are created equal, most African Americans would experience little significance to the change of leadership in in North America. But a lot of northern states would actually end slavery during this time. So it's primarily a southern institution now. All right, last slide for the day. So how radical were the changes that were made by the American Revolution? So this is an idea I want you to keep in mind. Was the revolution a radical break from the past, or a conservative attempt to safeguard traditional liberties? All right. So traditional, that is conservative, like the way things that have been going on for a long time, or radical, where there's a drastic immediate change. These are some ideas I want you to keep in mind. All right. So that is going to do it for today. And we will come back next time where we will start getting into the idea of forming a new version of a national government that will lead us to the Constitution.